In America and on the global markets overnight, the US President Donald Trump has stunned global markets with another dramatic U-turn in his tariff war. We'll see how it all flows through to the Australian market when it opens this morning at 10 o'clock. We thought you might have some questions about this, so we better call Saul. Saul Eslake is an independent economist watching everything unfold overnight. Very good morning, Saul.
Good morning, Hamish.
What does this mean for us?
Well, nothing in the short term, because the 10% tariff to which Australia was subjected, despite the fact that we run a deficit with the United States, will remain at 10%. And that's true of that's also going to be true of Heard and MacDonald Islands with the seals and penguins and all the others. So there's no direct impact for us, except I suppose that the Australian share market will no doubt follow Wall Street up today and thus reverse some of the very substantial losses that have been suffered since this madness all started last week.
And what is this doing to the global markets? Like, just so that we can think about what happens here at 10 o'clock, how have they reacted?
Well, the share market was up by almost 10%. In New York overnight. It was initially down, and then Trump announced his back down on his so-called reciprocal tariffs, with the exception of China, on which he slapped another 20% for, as he put it, disrespecting world markets, as if Trump somehow has done something different. The market saw that as a back down from a crazy set of policies, rather than, as Trump would have people believe, a clever negotiating tactic, what the guy in Blackadder would have called a cunning plan, Baldrick would have called a cunning plan, that they saw it as a back down from a crazy economic growth damaging set of policies. And so some of the losses that have been incurred since last week were reversed. But it's perhaps worth noting that even with this 10% recovery overnight, Wall Street is still down 11% from its peak in early February.
Now, Trump says that he did this because people were getting yippy and afraid. Is that what was happening, or is he getting yippy and afraid?
Well, he wouldn't want you to think that. As I say, he would want you to think that this was all a carefully laid out plan, and that as a result of the so-called reciprocal tariffs he announced last week, he told a Republican dinner on Monday night that 75 leaders had phoned him wanting to, and I'm quoting him directly, kiss his ass, unquote. Not the sort of language I would use, not the sort of language a president of the United States would normally use at a public function whilst wearing a tuxedo, but that's what he did. But those 75 leaders haven't made any concessions to the United States at all yet, and yet he's back down. So he probably was spooked by the market reaction, and perhaps in particular spooked by the reaction not so much of the stock market, but of the bond market, which doesn't attract as much attention, but in some ways is a much more important market for the functioning of the world economy than the stock market.
So the bond market you're talking about US government bonds, which are often seen as a safe bet in complicated times, and in part this is sort of like an IOU, right? And it's an indication of trust and faith in the American economy as a safeguard, a safe rail for the global economy. What's happened to those?
Well, it might be worth remembering, Hamish, James Carville, who was the advisor to Bill Clinton in the early 90s, who coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," also said that if he ever died and came back, he'd want to come back as the bond market because, as he said, you can intimidate anybody. And that reflects the importance, as you just described, of the bond market to the functioning of the US economy and the global financial system. I mean, at face value, the bond market is how the US government funds its gargantuan budget deficits. If the bond market wasn't there, they couldn't do that.
So huge US government debts just become a lot more expensive to pay off, which ultimately potentially weakens the US economy a bit more and increases the likelihood of recession.
Right. Now, normally what happens, as you said, when there is great uncertainty, or indeed when there is certainty that the US is heading for a recession, what normally happens is that bond yields, the interest on government debt, goes down. And that's because when people are uncertain or they're fearful that there's a recession and shares are going to fall, then they buy government bonds because they're considered to be safe, and interest rates normally come down during recessions or periods of uncertainty. And when interest rates go down, that means the value of bonds goes up. But what's happened since Trump announced the so-called reciprocal tariffs last week is that the yield on government bonds went from, this is 10-year bonds, went from about 4.01% to earlier today, American time, 4.47% before falling back a bit to 4.36% after a government bond auction went reasonably well. And I think that spooked Donald Trump and the people around him.
I'm talking to Saul Eslake, independent economist, Nolene in Wollongong. You've got a question for Saul, and I've seen a lot of people asking this question, actually. What is it?
Oh, okay. Well, I haven't heard anyone, but it's where my mind went first. I'd really like to know how much insider trading was enjoyed by Donald Trump and Elon Musk and his favourite people.
Overnight. I mean, you probably don't know the explicit answer to that, Saul, but this is a pretty big deal, isn't it? A lot of people would have had knowledge both now and even last week about what the administration was going to do.
Well, some people clearly didn't, including the US trade representative, that is the person who's supposed to be the spokesperson for and advisor to the president on trade matters, was testifying before Congress about Trump's reciprocal tariffs and the plan they represented whilst Trump was making his announcement about backing down on them. So clearly not everyone who you might have thought would have known actually did know, but it's quite possible that other people around the president in official positions might have had inside knowledge of what the president was about to announce. Now, I'm not going to say that they sought to profit from that knowledge. That would be a criminal offence, although presumably if it is a criminal offence, Donald Trump would then pardon them for it, as he has pardoned other people who committed criminal offences but supported him.
Okay. It has been a huge screeching U-turn. Saul, what's the biggest U-turn you've ever done?
Well, sticking to the American theme, it is that when I was a lot younger, I used to be opposed to compulsory voting. I used to think that, well, you should obviously pay your taxes and stop at red lights and that sort of thing. As few things as possible ought to be compulsory, and I didn't see why you should be forced to vote. Then in 1982, I spent 6 weeks in the United States on a kind of study tour, and I changed my mind because I saw in the United States how voluntary voting increased the power of single-issue zealots like the anti-abortion lobby and the gun lobby, because they turn out to vote on their particular single issues. And so I thought, well, you've got a choice between having the outcomes of elections determined by people who care too much about single issues, or if, as in Australia, you have compulsory voting, the outcome can be determined by people who don't give a stuff. If that's the choice, I'd rather the Australian one. And so I changed my mind about the wisdom of compulsory voting. And I think the outcomes of American elections prove that Australia has very good electoral institutions.
Thank you very much, Saul.